The moment I walked through the front door of my fiance's family home carrying a casserole dish and wearing a clearance rack cardigan I'd bought specifically for this occasion, his mother looked at me the way you look at a stain you're not sure will come out. She didn't say anything right away. She just let her eyes travel from my shoes, which were clean but clearly not designer, up to my face, and then she smiled. That particular kind of smile that isn't really a smile at all. "So," she said, "you're the one." I said yes. I told her it was so nice to finally meet her. I held out the casserole dish and said I'd made her recipe, the green bean one that my fiance had described to me 3 times because he was so proud that I'd asked for it. She took it from me without looking at it. That was the moment I knew exactly what the next few hours were going to feel like. My name is Joanna, and at the time of that dinner, I was 31 years old, working as a pediatric occupational therapist at a hospital in Columbus, Ohio, earning just under $17,000 a month. I had a 401k. I had a savings account I was genuinely proud of. I had a condo I'd bought at 28, with a down payment I'd scraped together over 4 years of working double shifts and skipping vacations. Nobody at that dinner table knew any of that. To them, I was the woman their son and brother had started dating 6 months ago, who worked something in healthcare, who rented an apartment in a neighborhood that wasn't impressive, who drove a 2017 Honda Civic with a small dent above the rear wheel, well, that I kept meaning to fix but never did. Every single one of those things was true. What I left out was the salary, the savings, the investment account, the fact that I paid off my graduate school loans 2 years ahead of schedule. I left those things out on purpose. Here's the part where I have to go back further because none of this makes sense without what happened with my ex. His name was Derek. We dated for 2.5 years. I thought we were going to get married. I thought he was thoughtful and kind and secure in himself. All the things I'd been told to look for. We met at a conference, got coffee, then dinner, then more dinners, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, I fell in love with him. About a year into the relationship, I got promoted. It was a significant promotion. My salary jumped considerably, and I was genuinely excited. I came home that evening with a bottle of wine and told him over dinner. He went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet, where someone is processing good news. The other kind. The kind where you can actually feel the air in the room change temperature. He said he was happy for me. He said all the right words in all the right order. But something shifted that night, and it never shifted back. Over the next few months, the comments started. Small ones at first. "Must be nice to be the breadwinner. I guess I'm dating someone out of my league." Said with a laugh, always with a laugh, like jokes. But they came more and more often, and the laugh started sounding like something else. He broke up with me 8 months later, told me he felt emasculated, that he couldn't see a future where he didn't feel like he was falling behind, that he needed to be with someone who made him feel like enough. I cried for 3 weeks, then I got angry for about 2 months. Then I went to therapy. My therapist was the one who said something I've never forgotten. She said, "You didn't do anything wrong, but you might want to understand what you're actually looking for before you let someone else get that close again." I spent a long time thinking about what that meant. What I landed on was this: I needed to know before I got serious with someone that they were in it for me, not for what I could offer. Not because having a partner who earns well makes life easier. But for me, the person who still argues with herself at Costco about whether the giant bag of coffee is actually a good deal, who cries at animal rescue videos, who is not always easy to love. I needed to know that a man would show up for Joanna with the dented Honda the same way he'd show up for any other version of me. So when I met Wesley, I decided not to tell him. We met at a trivia night at a bar downtown. My friend had dragged me there. I hadn't wanted to go, and I'd spent the first 20 minutes standing near the back wall holding a beer and feeling vaguely sorry for myself. Then a man appeared next to me and said very seriously, "Do you know what year Dolly Parton released Jolene? Because our table is having a crisis." I told him 1973. He looked so relieved that I almost laughed. His name was Wesley. He was 34, taught high school history, coached the junior varsity soccer team on the side, and had forearms that I noticed immediately and then felt embarrassed about noticing. We ended up at the same table for the second half of trivia. Our teams merged. We lost badly. He bought me a drink anyway to apologize for dragging me into the losing effort. We exchanged numbers. He texted the next morning. Not that evening. Not 3 days later. The next morning. A normal hour. Just a link to a Dolly Parton documentary with the message, "Further research." I thought about that text for the rest of the day. We went on our first date the following week. Italian place, nothing fancy. He made a reservation anyway. He asked me questions and actually listened to the answers. He talked about his students the way people talk about things they genuinely love. He split the check without making a thing of it and without looking at me like he expected me to argue. I drove home and sat in my car in the parking garage for a few minutes because I didn't know what to do with how good I felt. I did not tell him my salary. I said I worked in pediatric healthcare. When he asked what kind, I said occupational therapy. When he asked if I liked it, I said I loved it more than anything I'd ever done. All of that was completely true. He didn't ask what I made. Most people don't on a first date. But over the following weeks, as things got more serious, the topic of money started to come up the way it does when two adults are figuring out whether they fit into each other's lives. I let him believe I was comfortable, but not particularly well off. I mentioned that my apartment was a bit of a stitch some months. I paused on a weekend trip he suggested because I said I was trying to save. All of it was just slightly adjacent to the truth. The truth being that I was actively choosing to live below my means and put money away, which can look very similar to not having much if you don't ask too many questions. He started paying for more things. Not in a showy way, he'd just reach for the check a little faster, suggest places he knew were within a certain range, offer to cover when I claimed I was short. And the way he did it mattered. He never made me feel small. He never made it feel like a transaction. He just quietly made things easier, the way you do when you care about someone. I watched all of it. I watched how he talked to wait staff. I watched how he handled the moments when things didn't go as planned. I watched how he treated the idea of me, not impressive on paper me, just me. 6 months in, he told me he loved me. We were in the kitchen of his apartment. He was making eggs, and he just said it like it was something he'd been carrying around and had finally decided to set down. I told him I loved him too, and I meant it more than I'd meant almost anything. 2 months after that, he asked me to marry him. A quiet evening, no grand gesture, just a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and a question he asked like he already knew he wanted to spend the rest of his life figuring out the answer alongside me. I said yes. And then I thought, his family doesn't know anything about me, and given what I've just done for 8 months, this might go very badly. His parents lived 45 minutes outside Columbus in a house that was not flashy but was solidly, comfortably upper middle class. His father had retired from a career in insurance management. His mother, Sandra, had worked in real estate for 30 years and still kept her license active just in case. His younger sister, Felicity, was 28, worked in marketing, and had, according to my fiancé, very strong opinions about most things and wasn't shy about sharing them. The Sunday dinner invitation came 3 weeks after the engagement. I spent more time thinking about what to wear than I will ever admit. I settled on the clearance cardigan and dark jeans and my most normal shoes. I made the green bean casserole. I practiced being low-key in the car on the drive over. I was not prepared for Sandra. She was immaculate. Pressed blouse, perfect hair, a hostess gift level of presentation in her own home at 6 on a Sunday evening. She took the casserole dish without enthusiasm, set it on the counter, and spent the next 20 minutes giving me a tour of the house that felt less like hospitality and more like an inventory check. "This is where we host the investment group," she said, gesturing to the dining room. "We do dinners for clients a few times a year. Do you entertain?" I said not really, mostly smaller gatherings at my place. She nodded the way people nod when they've confirmed a suspicion. His father, Gerald, was easier. He shook my hand, offered me a drink, and asked me about my work with genuine interest. He had a nephew who'd done some kind of therapy work and seemed to understand that it was difficult and meaningful. I liked him immediately. Felicity arrived 20 minutes late with a bottle of wine that was better than anything on the table and a smile that reached her eyes about halfway. She hugged her brother. She looked at me. "So, you're the one who finally got him to commit," she said. "That's impressive. He's been difficult since approximately 2009. I laughed. She didn't. Dinner itself was fine on the surface. The food was good. The conversation moved. But underneath it, I could feel Sandra steering things in a direction I recognized, toward my future, my plans, my situation, my stability. She asked where I saw myself in 5 years. She asked whether my field offered opportunities for advancement. She asked twice whether my apartment was rent controlled, which seemed like an oddly specific thing to ask. At one point, when my fiancé had stepped away from the table to help his father with something in the kitchen, she leaned forward slightly and said, almost gently, "Wesley is very loyal. He'd do anything for the people he loves. We just want to make sure those people deserve that." I looked at her for a moment. "I understand," I said. "I'm sure you do," she said. Felicity across the table was looking at her wine glass with the expression of someone who'd seen this particular play before. On the drive home, my fiancé held my hand across the center console and said his mom just needed time to warm up, that she was like this with everyone at first, that she'd come around. He believed it. I could tell he genuinely believed it. I didn't say anything. I looked out at the highway and thought about how much longer I could keep doing this. The answer, it turned out, was about 3 more weeks. It wasn't a dramatic unraveling, it was a Tuesday. My fiancé had left his laptop at my apartment, and when he swung by to pick it up, he arrived earlier than expected, and I was on a work call. A real work call. The kind where I was discussing a treatment plan with a physician and a department coordinator, and using language that doesn't sound like someone who is just in healthcare. I didn't notice him come in. I finished the call, turned around, and he was standing in the hallway. He had a look on his face I hadn't seen before. "Who were you talking to?" he asked. I told him. I explained the call. And then, because he was standing there looking at me like he was trying to solve something, I said, "I think there are some things I should have told you earlier." We sat at the kitchen table. I told him everything: the salary, the savings account, the condo equity, the reason I hadn't said anything, Derek, the promotion, the way that relationship had ended, the fear that I'd carried into this one. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "So for 8 months you let me think you were struggling." I said yes. I said I was sorry. I said I knew it wasn't fair, that it was my fear that had driven the decision and not anything he had done wrong, that he had been nothing but good to me the entire time and he deserved better than being kept in the dark. He stood up. He said he needed to think. He left. I sat at that kitchen table for I don't know how long. He didn't call for 2 days. Those were two of the longest days I've experienced as an adult. I went to work. I came home. I sat with my phone on the coffee table and watched it not ring. I thought about calling him and then decided I owed him the space to process without me pushing. On the third day, he called. He said he'd talked to his dad, that his dad had said something like, "She was afraid of the same thing happening again. That's not manipulation. That's someone who got hurt and didn't know how to trust yet." He said he wasn't sure if he agreed completely. He said he'd been angry and confused, and that the thing that kept pulling him back was not the money, not the revelation about the money, but the fact that in every other way, in every conversation, every argument we'd had, every moment, I had been completely honest with him. He said he'd been trying to think of a time when I'd been anything other than exactly myself, and he couldn't find one. He said, "You were real. The relationship was real. You were just scared." I said yes. He said, "I wish you trusted me sooner, but I understand why you didn't." He said he still wanted to marry me. I started crying in a way that was deeply ungraceful and completely sincere. Sandra found out 2 weeks later when my fiancé told his parents everything because he said he was done letting her pick at me from a distance without knowing who she was actually picking at. The dinner at which this happened was apparently memorable. I was not present. My fiancé gave me a condensed version afterward. His mother had gone through several stages: initial shock, then something that might have been respect or might have been recalibration. It was hard to tell with her. Then, somewhat predictably, concern that I had been deceptive. My fiancé had told her very calmly that I had been afraid, that he understood why, and that whether his family chose to accept me had no bearing on whether he had chosen me, because he had clearly, completely, and without reservation. Felicity, according to my fiancé, had said exactly nothing during all of this. She had simply poured herself more wine. Afterward, she texted me directly. No preamble. Just, "For what it's worth, I knew something was off from the beginning." In a good way. Most people trying to impress my mother try much harder. "You were just there." I liked that. Then, also, that green bean casserole was genuinely better than the family recipe. Don't tell her I said that. Sandra called me the following week. It was a short call. She said she wanted to understand me better and asked if we could have lunch. I said yes. Lunch was stiff but honest. She told me about a woman she'd known early in her marriage who had married Gerald's brother for money and made everyone miserable. I told her I understood why that story would make her cautious. She said she supposed she'd been applying that caution broadly. We did not become close friends that afternoon, but something real happened, and I think we both knew it. We got married the following October. Small wedding, a vineyard outside Columbus, 63 people. My sister as my maid of honor, my fiancé's dad crying quietly during the ceremony, while Sandra sat next to him with impeccable posture and dabbed at her eyes in a way she clearly believed was invisible. Felicity gave a toast that was sharp and funny and ended with something like, "He picked someone who shows up as herself." As someone who's watched this family for 28 years, I cannot tell you what a relief that is. My husband squeezed my hand under the table. I thought about the drive home from that first family dinner, the highway, the feeling of sitting with something I didn't know how to carry, the way I had looked at my own life and decided that I would rather know, even if knowing meant risking everything. I don't think I'd do it exactly the same way again. I know I waited too long to tell him. I know that fear isn't a justification, only an explanation. I know the trust rebuilt in those 8 months was real and also built on an incomplete foundation, and that he was right to feel what he felt when the truth came out. But I also know that the test, if you want to call it that, and I'm not sure I do anymore, worked. Not because it proved what I was afraid of, but because what it showed me was the opposite. It showed me a man who paid for dinner without keeping score, who showed up when things were inconvenient, who, when the truth landed, chose to stay angry for 2 days and then chose me anyway. You can't manufacture that, you can only find it. And I did. I still think about the green bean casserole sometimes. The way I carried it to that door with both hands like an offering, like proof of something. Proof of what exactly, I wasn't sure. That I was trying. That I could be the kind of person who shows up with a homemade dish and a steady smile, even when everything underneath is complicated. What I have come to understand, slowly and not always comfortably, is that the choices we make out of fear have consequences, not because the universe is keeping score, but because people are perceptive. Sandra sensed something was off before she could name it. Wesley heard something in my voice on that phone call before I said a word of explanation. The truth has a way of pressing against the edges of whatever container you've tried to put it in, and eventually, the container gives. I made a decision out of self protection, and I don't entirely regret it. But I also can't pretend it was without cost. Wesley sat with 2 days of hurt that I handed him. That was real. His quiet on the other end of the phone those first 48 hours was something I caused, and sitting with that, without excuse, without rushing to justify myself, was one of the harder things I've done. Integrity isn't only about telling the truth. It's also about being honest with yourself when you've fallen short of it and not flinching from that. The thing that saved us, I think, was that I hadn't been dishonest about who I was, only about what I had. And there's a difference, though it took me a while to articulate it. Wesley fell in love with someone who argued over Costco purchases and cried at animal rescue videos and showed up to uncomfortable family dinners with casserole dishes and shaky hands. That person was me, fully, completely me. The salary was a number. The woman he asked to marry him was not a performance. But here's what I also know. Knowing that doesn't make the 8 months of a mission harmless. It just means we had something real enough to survive it. And surviving it required something from both of us. From me, the willingness to finally be completely seen, to put the fear down and trust that he would not do what Derek did. From him, the intelligence to separate what mattered from what didn't and the steadiness to choose based on that rather than on injured pride. There's a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It's not the strength of never being afraid, it's the strength of being afraid and eventually doing the honest thing anyway, even when you can't control what happens next. I waited too long to find that in myself, but I found it. Felicity's toast at the wedding has stayed with me. He picked someone who shows up as herself. I wasn't entirely sure that was true of me, not for those 8 months. But I knew, by the time I was standing in that vineyard in October with my husband's hand in mine, that I was going to spend the rest of my life making it true. Not because it's easy, because it's the only foundation that holds. You can build a lot of things on the version of yourself you think people want, but you can only build a life on who you actually are.